Hello everyone, my name is Frederick and I'll be doing my disease report over the disease, or Zika virus disease, for Dr. Cody's microbiology course. Just to give a brief intro to Zika, Zika virus is a small envelope positive sense single-stranded RNA virus belonging to the genus Flavivirus and of the Flaviviridae family, that has reemerged in recent years as a human pathogen with epidemic potential. To date, the epidemic continues on in mainly the South America, Africa, Brazil, and Asia. And there are tens of thousands of cases confirmed in those areas. Some other names for Zika include Zika fever, Zika, and then some other members of the Flavivirus or Flavivirus in the genus include ones that cause dengue, yellow fever, and West Nile fever. And then obviously the group 4 positive ssRNA. And then over here you can see some of the different strains of Zika. And then you can also see how closely related dengue, and you can't see it down here, but the yellow fever is down here as well. You can see an immature and mature state of the actual virus. And then moving on here, so some of the characteristics of the virus. It originates and spreads through mosquitoes. The two most prevalent types or species of mosquito being the Aedes aegypti and the Aedes albopictus. The aegypti one species is definitely the more prevalent one. Like other flaviviruses, Zika virus is enveloped in an icosahedral and has a non-segmented, single-stranded 10 kilobase positive sense RNA genome. Now, as for the actual structure, the structure of the Zika virus is similar to the other flaviviruses. It contains a nucleocapsid approximately 25 to 30 nanometers in diameter, surrounded by a host membrane-derived lipid bilayer that contains enveloped proteins E and M, and the virion itself is approximately 40 nanometers in diameter, and then the surface projections on the outside would measure 5 to 10 nanometers. And then we'll talk about some of the actual pathology and symptoms later on. And then the notable strains and pathogenesis of Zika virus. There are two genetically distinct Zika virus lineages, including the African and Asian ones. The Asian one is linked primarily to microcephaly, we believe, and the African lineage is more linked to prolonged neurological effects. And microcephaly in the Asian lineage mainly affects just the fetuses, or only can really affect the fetuses of pregnant women. And an interesting fact about that actually is in past years and up until I think it was 2017 or 2018, we didn't really have any way to order the Asian and African lineages because there was just some sort of error. And one of my sources actually redid the genetic classification of it and found an error and found that the Asian lineage is actually linked to the African lineage. But Zika can be easily confused with several other diseases because they have similar symptoms, and they're all actually in similar areas. So like some examples would be like dengue, yellow fever, but similar symptoms would be like the chikungunya virus and dengue. Those are mainly the two ones. So going into the history of the Zika virus, the first Zika virus strain, MR766, was isolated in 1947 in Uganda. And in 2007, this is where it was kind of reemerged. But it seemed to be more of a benign virus because 5,000 people on the Yap Island of the Federated States of Micronesia were infected, which is 70% of the population, but there were 0 deaths as a result of the Zika virus. And it was just viewed to be a benign disease up until 2013 to 2014. In French Polynesia, there were 30,000 cases, 42 cases of GBS, and I'll talk about that later, which is another serious neurological disorder, which was unnamed in one of the sources that I heard about it. And it caused 12 patients to need respiratory assistance, and 16 needed intensive care and were hospitalized for 51 days. And needed 3 months before they could be discharged. and only about half of those patients were able to walk out without assistance at the end of their stay at the hospital. So going into the transmission of the disease, we can't figure out a whole lot about the pathogenesis because it just hasn't been as prevalent for a while. But we believe that mosquitoes are born in water that has just been sitting around for a while, and oftentimes it can be a reservoir for tons of different kinds of infection. And these mosquitoes are born immediately infected, and then they go out and they bite one host, and then that person becomes a reservoir for infection for an uninfected mosquito that can then come in, bite them, and then that mosquito is infected, and then they can go bite someone else and infect them as well. We also recently found out from the 2013-2014 case that Zika is actually kind of an STD. It can be sexually transmitted because the semen in men tend to actually be kind of a good preservative um, for the Zika virus, and the epithelial lining or the mucosal lining of the vagina for women is actually a somewhat viable reservoir for infection. Um, let's see, and then the human. Oh, I'm sorry. No, actually, we'll move on to the next slide. So, who's actually at risk here? Anywhere with tropical climates that allow for plenty of mosquito growth, and at the same time is an area where it's a fairly dense population. Poor infrastructure can assist in the disease's spreading because people in Brazil, Africa, and Asia often don't have sleeping nets or deterrents or bright colored clothing to help deter these mosquitoes. And these outbreaks of Zika have occurred in Africa, Southeast Asia, Pacific Islands, Caribbean Islands, South and Central America, and Mexico. But the sexually transmitted ones actually, cases have been seen in countries like the United States, France, Germany, Italy, and New Zealand. Moving on to the symptoms now, researchers are still discovering new symptoms and the effects caused by Zika. They're particularly focusing on the developing fetuses involving the Asian strain. But some of the main symptoms include fever, red raised rash, conjunctivitis, headaches, joint and muscle pain, physical weakness. But an interesting note is that about 80% of people infected won't actually show symptoms. In other words, they're asymptomatic. Which means that people could be sexually transmitting the disease without even knowing that they have it, and it is often recommended that people abstain from sex for about 6 months actually after they've been infected. And so you're just wondering now how many of these people, how many people in the United States even might actually have the infection without even knowing it. It could be spreading this whole time and we don't even know it. And then moving on to the pathology of the actual disease, microcephaly, Guillain-Barré syndrome, and ADEM are being connected to the virus, which is primarily transmitted through the Aedes aegypti mosquito. And then going into the actual description of each of these diseases, microcephaly is a condition where a baby's head is much smaller than expected. During pregnancy, a baby's head grows because the baby's brain grows, and due to the neurological effect, or due to the effects of the Zika virus, brain development halts, head development halts, but the rest of the body continues to grow. So the baby is born with an abnormally small head, and there are severe cases where the head is even more abnormally small, and these babies, them in general, they can't function on their own, and it leads to comparisons of autism. And that's mainly in the Asian strain. The African strain mainly has the Guillain-Barré syndrome and ADEM. ADEM is where the brain and the spinal cord and the optic nerve swell and inflame, and it blocks these parts, and it can cause some permanent damage. And then the Guillain-Barré syndrome often begins just with tingling at the feet and the legs, and it works its way up the body. Some people, it works the exact opposite. It works from the arms and face down. But it can lead to paralysis even. Moving on to the immune response of the Zika, or how the body responds to the Zika virus. Since the Zika since Zika isn't very well understood up till only recently, there wasn't a serious outbreak, and there hasn't been much time to do extensive research on how the body reacts. Some of the things that we know right now, B and T cell-mediated adaptive immune responses inhibit ZIKV in animal models, which means that humans and non-human primates are the primary sources of infection for this virus. They don't work well in other animals. Early phase of clinical trials in humans have demonstrated safety and immunogenicity. And then the ZIKV vaccines have or may need to consider potential enhancement of the DenV infection, which is just dengue. And then the GSB neurological damage can be more intense with these vaccines. Moving on to diagnosis and treatment. Diagnosis, the process itself is very limited in most areas of the disease because they are in areas like Brazil, Africa, Asia, where medical attention is very limited. And you see these programs that launch relief efforts to bring a bunch of different resources that they need, like nets and deterrents. And it's really difficult to diagnose Zika too because it has very similar effects or symptoms as dengue and chikungunya viruses, and these viruses are in the same area as each other. The only way really to figure out if you have either one of these diseases is by doing blood work and by doing a urine test. And then going on to treatments, there is no vaccine right now or antiviral treatment. Supportive care includes rest fluids, pain relievers, and fever-reducing medications. But once a person has been infected, it is believed that they are probably protected from future infection. But the reason why Zika is so dangerous is because from 2007 to 2013, it just somehow it grew into something that could be on an epidemic proportion, and it could. I mean, think about it. If it spreads to everyone and it can cause neurological damage and cause us to not, or cause our children to not, grow properly, it literally limits our population, and that's incredibly dangerous for the human species. And as far as preventing the actual disease, pregnant women should avoid traveling to areas with Zika, and there are websites where you can go and you can search and figure out what areas are at risk, where you would be at risk. Take precautions when visiting Zika prevalent areas. Wear bright clothing, sleep under nets, keep windows and doors closed, use air conditioning, and apply repellents to exposed skin. The sources that I have actually have a bunch of different protocols for how they handle it, and some of the research that they do as well is on some of these sources of mine. So there's not much time left, but there are many small organizations performing research on Zika virus disease. There are many relief efforts to bring resources to people and families in need. RTI.org predicts that there will be 3 to 4 million people across the Americas, North and South, that will be infected by Zika in the next year, and that will steadily grow each year after. And the World Health Organization, along with the CDC, are taking measures to source a vaccine, but fear it could actually emphasize the adverse effects of the virus. And then a little abstract view of the actual Zika virus. The overall view of the virus, we don't very well understand it, and in many areas, ranging from its virology, the epidemiology, and the clinical spectrum of the complications it causes. The big picture is that the disease went from 2007, a benign virus, to a 2013 World Health concern, and is growing every year to be more and more prevalent. Very easy. It's not very easy to contain because people just don't know if they have it. 20% of people don't even realize that they are carriers of the disease, or even have an opportunity to figure that out. And not to mention that it is technically a sexually transmitted disease. These are my references. I wish I had more time to talk about this. Zika is actually a very interesting disease. I recommend you actually look this stuff up. I actually plan on submitting my script that I read from with this as well. I think this is a very interesting disease, and we should spread more awareness of it because it can be very dangerous for us. Thank you very much.